Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Living Manna Church. I'm Pastor Dave Sain, Senior Shepherd at Living Manna Church. You are here on Wednesday night. It is our Wednesday night Bible study. Thank you so much for hanging out with me tonight. Got an interesting Bible study for you guys tonight. We are getting into part 2 of something we started actually 2 weeks ago. We took a little bit of a detour last week, talked a little bit about Hanukkah. Yeshua and Hanukkah. I definitely encourage you to go back and check out that video if you haven't seen it yet. Neat teaching. But we're going to go back to what we started a couple of weeks ago, a little bit different Bible study than we normally do. So review, I guess, for many, for some at least, but I think you'll enjoy it. The title and topic for today, and let me just pop this up. There it is. The title for today is Square Peg in a Round Hole. Yep, square peg in a round hole. Good evening, everybody. Those guys that are joining us online, thank you so much for hanging out with me. This is going to be number 2 in the series that we've done. I don't know how long this is going to go. It's not going to go too long, probably just right into maybe 2022, maybe the first week or so. I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 tops, maybe 6 tops studies. It's a little bit of review, some information that maybe some of you are aware of already, but the theme, or at least the idea, the concept, if you would, my thinking in putting together this study was to do the following. I just a couple of goals I want us to have. We talked about this again 2 weeks ago, but some goals that I want you to consider or think about as we go through this study. Because normally, if you've been part of these studies, normally we start in a book, right? We start in a book, chapter 1, verse 1, and then we go all the way through it. And of course, it takes us, just all over the place. This is a little bit different study. It's more of a topical study. I want to talk about the gospel journey, but really to accomplish what I hope to accomplish anyway, are these 4 things. Number 1, and let me just put this a little bit bigger so all you guys can see that. 4 main concepts or ideas that I want us to cover. Number 1, I want us to learn or be familiar with what the overarching story of the Bible is, what the gospel is. Now, there's a lot to the gospel. Honestly, if we did like a really detailed thing in the gospel, that could take months and months and months. And we're sort of doing that on our weekend messages. So I definitely encourage you to be part of our weekend messages because it's really complementary to what we're doing. But the story is so big, it's impossible to get it all. But what I want to do is at least make you familiar with what the general overarching story is. Because most people, honestly, don't know what the general overarching beginning to end story is. Now, there's lots of different stories in it, but what the general story is. So that's number 1 goal. Number 2, I want us to be able to understand how Yah works or how Yah thinks. And maybe that's a little bit presumptuous because there is no way for us to truly understand how Yah thinks. But what we can understand the mind of Messiah in this terminology, in that we can understand how he wants us to understand how he thinks. And of course, that is really the key to interpreting, the key to understanding, to understand how Yah speaks in one part of the scripture and what that then means for something later on. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. And then number 3, I want us to, the reason we're doing this, the reason that we really need to know the overarching story, the reason we need to know how Yah thinks is because we need to present this gospel to other people, right? And that's the whole idea, to be able to articulate your faith, to be able to sit down in an intelligent way and A after B, A, B, C, D, go through step by step what this is actually about. And again, it's probably not what most of us have heard before, but I want us by the end of this to be able to at least come up with a short outline of how we can then minister the gospel to other people. And of course, the whole reason for doing all of this is to make disciples, right? That's the entire reason. We're going to touch on a little bit of that today. It is to make disciples, to teach people, to learn. So with all of that, let's open up with a word of prayer, and then we'll jump right into it. Father, as we say always, give us eyes to see, ears to hear, and a heart that's willing to obey. In Yeshua's name, amen. Amen. Okay, so the notes are up, guys. You'll see them obviously on the screen here, but if you go to the description box there on YouTube. The notes are there, or if you go to the app, they are also there. You can download them. You can follow me along. You can edit them as in the app as you go along. So so enjoy that. You can be part of it. You can have it at your home, wherever it is that you're watching from, and of course they'll be up on the split screen with me right here as well. So all of that. Let's get into this actual study. So here we go. We talked about this a little bit last week, and again, some of this is going to be maybe a little bit basic, and I wanted to sort of get into some of the basics, not so much 101, but maybe I guess we can call it milk, if you would. But then again, milk to one person could be, filet mignon to another, depending upon what you've been told, how much you understand. But we talked about 2 weeks ago the idea that having a piece of the picture, a puzzle. Think of it as a puzzle. Of course, you can see on the picture there, there's the guy there and he's holding up that little piece of a puzzle. We've all put together a puzzle before. We've all done this before. We've all been kids. And just because there is a piece of the picture, and no matter how important that piece of the puzzle is, it is made to fit in a much bigger picture. So even though you may have what could be the centerpiece of a puzzle, it's really only a piece of a much, much broader story. And this principle definitely applies in our understanding of the gospel, because there's a lot of people that understand probably one of the biggest puzzle pieces there is, and that, of course, is the crucifixion. And that is important. There is no doubt that is important. It is a huge, huge puzzle piece. However, we should strive to, yes, understand the puzzle piece, but we also need to understand the picture. Because if all you've got is that puzzle piece, there's context that's missing. There's information that's missing that may say things about that puzzle piece that you don't realize just looking at that picture. And that's what we're going to talk about today. Context, context, context. You guys have heard me say this many, many, many other times before. Everything is about context. When you read verses, when you're discussing with somebody, when you're doing your own study, everything is about context. It's normally not a good thing just to pull. Now, some verses you can pull them out by themselves, and they say what they mean what they say. But even then, you should always read them in the context to whatever verses come before, whatever verses come after. What is the theme of the entire book that you happen to be reading in, and then how does that attach to the rest of the story? Context, context, context. Sister Karen used to work in mortgages. She was a banker, actually, vice president of a bank many years ago. And of course, the whole thing with real estate is location, location, location. Wherever, if you got the good location, your real estate will be obviously worth a whole lot more. Well, to take that sort of location, location, location analogy, everything is context, context, context. How does that puzzle piece fit into the whole of the story? How does it complement the whole of the story? What does the whole of the story tell us about that puzzle piece? And that is so important and unfortunately vital. It's missed. It's missed in our modern kind of religious world today. Now, here's the puzzle piece. Just across the board. Ask, just most people, obviously we're Americans, so ask most Americans, do you believe in God? And most people will say, yeah, I believe in God. We've got the whole winter solstice thing coming up soon, and people are in their own mind celebrating, at least in their own concept, thinking they're celebrating the birth of the one who died on the cross and rose again. Now, obviously that's a whole different issue. Don't want to get into that for today. But you ask most have at least generally heard or seen the video or watched a movie or, saw something on YouTube about the basic story. And most would say, yeah, I heard the story. Yeah, a God sent his son he into the world, and then he died for us to forgive us of our sins. Now, I say that, almost lackadaisical, but I don't mean it that way. That's an important piece of the puzzle. It is a vital piece of the puzzle. but in context, it means so much more. And the dangerous thing is if we know that one puzzle piece, but we take it out of context, there is real danger, real possibility, not even possibility, probability, because it's already happened to us throughout the ages, of erring, of not understanding what the whole picture is, but then also not understanding the true meaning of the puzzle piece itself. So the statement that is that he came, he died, he rose again on the third day and ascended to the Father was not meant to stand alone. It's not a one-off in the Bible. It is connected to the rest of the scripture. And that's kind of the emphasis that I want us to hone in on a little bit today as we talk about context. Context. Write that down, jot that down, context. Okay, so here we go. Golgotha, the whole crucifixion scene. If you take it out of context, if we don't understand where it fits in the whole story, where it fits in history, where it fits in everything that's going on in the Bible in the Bible story, which unfortunately is what many have done for many, many years. Now, again, I'm not saying that it's not important. It is important, and it certainly is for a lot of people an eye-opener. It maybe starts people on that journey, but it is part of a much, much bigger picture. But if you take the story, if you take the information that's given to us, because most people, they begin this journey, you say, well, what do you need to start reading? Start reading the Gospel of John or Matthew, or Mark, or Luke. And you get to the story that he dies, he rises from the dead, and then ascends to the Father. If you take that piece of puzzle piece out of context, what has wound up happening in history as time has gone on, and this is really, I guess, the title of the message, you can see the neat picture up there, that is obviously a square peg that is being fit into a round hole. Now, obviously that statement is kind of silly because you're not supposed to put a square peg into a round hole, but you could if you beat the heck out of it. And of course, you see the hammer sitting there, and evidently you look at that and you can see, yeah, a lot of damage was done to that square piece to make it fit into that circular hole. And that same analogy has happened to us over history in our understanding of what this story is actually and truly about. I mean, it's a simple truth to get that, or a simple concept. Yes, God sent his son, he died, he rose again. But what happens with just that piece, if you take that piece and it's separated from everything that came forward, what we wind up doing is we wind up building our own context for it. We wind up creating a different story in which that scene will fit, in which that little puzzle piece will fit. And the problem is we wind up making stuff up, and we have done that. This is the religion of men. We make stuff up. We add and we take away. We make that square peg and we beat the tar out of it to try to make it fit into that hole. And then what we tell people is this is the story. You need to understand this puzzle piece, this one little red peg, and then that's it. And it's devoid, or it's separated from everything else. And that is very, very dangerous. And we'll see why in just a second. Let's take a look at the next screen. Here is, now we've talked about this before, the difference between making converts and making disciples. See, a convert, you tell them a piece of the story, you say, you need to know this piece of the story, and when you do, you've now joined us. And a convert is really someone who joins up, who becomes part of something, right? And the masters really, it may sound like we're splitting hairs here, but we're not. You're going to see in a couple of these scriptures. We've talked about this before, but it's worth reviewing. A convert is one who joins up, who becomes part of something. And here is the master's words from Matthew chapter 23, starting at verse 15. And these are the woes. This is when Yeshua is really going after, going after the Pharisees. And listen to what he says. You guys should know this. We've talked about this before, but listen to his words. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you go about land and sea to win, and there it is, one convert. Now, it depends on what version you read. It might say one proselyte, but the idea is that they were having Gentiles, not all of them, few, join up and go through whatever the ritual was, whatever the requirement was, including circumcision, doing all of this stuff so that they can be included or join up and have access to the temple and quote unquote access to God. Well, that's a convert. And the master's telling them, you're going everywhere. You're traveling. And they did. They went outside of Jerusalem. They traveled to make converts. And of course, listen to what the master says about converts. And when he is won, because that's what a convert is. It's someone you win over. See, the problem with winning over someone is that you have to offer them something, right? To win, it's, there's something that has to be offered for them to want to join. And we've all come from, all sorts of different religious names and groups in our journey to get where we are today. But if you think back, you remember, there were those times when you first began to hear this message, we were told, and we still are today, you can just watch it. It's all over TV, all over YouTube, all over everywhere. There is an offer of what God can do for you, of the blessing, of the finance, of the life now, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There is this offer, and we even use the term very, very often, we won someone to Christ. We won someone to God. And yet, this is the terminology that the master's using about the Pharisees, and this is not good terminology, because he says to them, you go about land and sea to win one convert. The problem with winning one convert, of having them join up, is that as quickly as you can win them, you can also lose them. And I've been doing this for a lot of years, guys. And again, you guys too, you've all seen this. I'm not telling you something you don't know. But in your own experience, think about how many people you know that were won, that came, that joined up. And quite often what we wind up hearing is, you come and you say whatever the prayer is, and now you're part. Now you're won over to him, and you need to come to our congregation, you need to come to our church, you need to learn, how we do things, you need to get in ministry, you need to go tell somebody something. And there's all of these kind of rules and directions and guidelines of stuff that you need to do to belong, to belong to that group, to that name. And we've all did it. We all kind of went through this to one degree or another. But think about how many people because I've known many over the years that were won and are no longer here. That as time has gone by, for whatever reason, they have gone by the wayside, or they wind up going from one place to another place to another place. We've all seen that as well. Those people that just, they go from one congregation to another congregation, from one preacher to another preacher. Something happens. They get upset. They get offended. Some sort of craziness goes on, and they wind up leaving and they go somewhere else. Out of all of the people, and even within the church world, there's this thing called the 80-20 rule, where it's the statistics wind up to be, out of all of the people that are in whatever congregation it is, it's normally about 20% of the people that are actually active, that are reading their Bibles, that are maybe coming to prayer services, that are active in something that's going on in the congregation, the 20%. Meanwhile, the 80%, they'll come once in a while, but they're not really involved. And I guess statistically speaking, I don't have this as an absolute fact, I'm just going by what I've observed over the years, I think that 20% actually are the ones, well, I think it's you. I think it's you. I think it's me. I think at some point we pursued and kept pursuing, and we got to where we are today. But that 80% that was won, where are they? Well, they're all over. So here's the master's words. You go out to win just one convert. And when he is won, you make him a son of the grave, Gehenna, twice as much as yourself. So again, this is a very, very familiar verse, but listen to what the master is saying about winning converts. It doesn't have a good light to it. There's a warning to the one who's doing it, And he's saying to the one that you win, they wind up being in a worse position than they were even before you won them. Now that's something to really, really think about, especially when we understand what instruction the master actually gave us. And here is, of course, Matthew chapter 28, verse 19, the difference between a convert and a disciple. Here's a disciple. So if a convert joins up, if a convert becomes part of the group, the name, the identity, the congregation, whatever it is, a disciple is one who learns, because that's really what disciple means, to discipline oneself, to learn. Matthew chapter 28, 19, of course, this is the Great Commission. You guys are familiar with this, but listen again to the master's words, as opposed to the words he just said to the Pharisees and their making of converts. It says, therefore, go and make taught ones. Now, of course, that's the scriptures version, but that word taught ones is in fact disciples or learned ones, people who discipline themselves, who learn, who understand. So the commission absolutely is not go out and make converts. That's what the Pharisees were doing. The commission, or the sending out of the people of the way, was to go to all the nations and make disciples of them, teach them, help them to learn, to understand what? The context, the whole story, not just the piece out of context, but the piece within the context, within the whole framework of the story. Make disciples, learned ones of all the nations. So here's again, just this isn't obviously the first time the master says this. This is said from right through the scripture, but here's just a couple of verses. This is John chapter 6, verse 45. We just recently talked about this. But here's the master again talking about learning. This is the whole feeding of the 5,000, the bread from heaven. But verse 45 says, it has been written in the prophets, and they shall be taught by Yah, Yod He, Vav He. Now, of course, he's quoting Isaiah. You guys can look that up. I forgot what it was. I don't know if it's chapter 40, but you guys can look that up. I forgot to put down what the reference for that. If somebody can find that for me, that would be awesome. But whatever it is, it's in Isaiah. And so he's quoting Isaiah, telling us that Isaiah told us there is going to come a time when Yah himself will come and teach us. Of course, that is a prophecy of the coming Messiah, who is Yah in the flesh, who comes and teaches. And that's exactly what he's doing in chapter 6. But listen to what the rest of that verse says. Everyone then who has heard from the Father, that is to believe. Now, you might want, maybe we can connect that with saying a prayer and acknowledging who he is, maybe possibly, but I think it goes much, much further beyond it. I think that goes into hearing his voice, being drawn to him, which probably happens way, way, way before we ever went to any sort of altar or anything like that. But here's the rest of the sentence. Everyone then who has heard from the Father, and I put it in red so that we get this, we got to get this, who heard from the Father and learned. And learned what? And learned the context. Learned the story, learned the picture, how all of this actually fits. Who has learned, let me one more time, he who has heard from the Father and learned, they come to me. So this idea of being a disciple as opposed to a convert is not just semantics here. This is a very important distinction that is being made, that there is a difference between the two. A disciple learns. A disciple studies. A disciple is hungry for information. I've heard, or I guess the experience has been over time, like I said, the whole 80-20 rule, people that really have heard from Yah, do really have faith in God, wherever they are in all of this world, wherever congregation or stuff they may be out there in the world, moving along in their journey. The one thing that is consistent in all of us is that we want to learn. We're not satisfied with just hearing, that Sunday message or coming to that once in a while Bible study. It is so imperative that if we are to be disciples, that we have to do our own studies. And where do we start? Where's the place we all must start? You got to read the stories. That's just 101. And you can read the stories, quite honestly, over and over and over, sometimes for a year, 2, 3, 4 years of just reading the same story over and over and over again, till you really begin to at least understand the story. And then one day a teacher or a preacher, one that Yah has truly anointed, or Yah will just open up your eyes to it, you will then begin to see the bigger picture. But I find that a lot of people that have a hard time, listening to sermons and teachings and say, well, it's a little bit too deep and I really can't understand it and I don't get it. If we really kind of take a look into what's going on in their lives, they're not reading. They're not going over the stories. They don't know what the actual stories are. And if you don't know the actual stories, then you're not going to get the other teaching later on. So, we have to be disciplined. We have to want to learn. We have to want to understand, to be hungry. And then Yah will put it all together and he'll bring a good teacher to us. He'll bring you to a place where you can be fed, or Yah will speak to your heart and open up things as you understand. But if you don't put in the work, you're not going to get anything out of it. This is about being a disciple, to be disciplined. Here's Matthew chapter 11 and verse 29. Same concept. Here's Yeshua again talking about learning. It says, take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am meek and humble in heart, and you shall find rest for your souls, for your beings is what the scripture version says, but for your souls is what the King James or NKJV would say. So, and we can go over scripture after scripture after scripture of learn, of be a disciple, of feed yourself. I mean, how many times do we hear the master talk about things like he that has, for him that has, more will be given to him. And for him that only has a little bit, even what he has will be taken away from him. He's talking about learning. He's talking about being a disciple. If you have and you're hungry for more, God will give you more. He'll help you to understand, to learn. But you got to have that tenacity, that desire to want to know. If you don't, even what you do have, even the one little puzzle piece you think you have, what he's telling us is he'll take that from you. We get that in the story of the talents, right? The guy that's got 10, he gets 10 more, 5 more. But the guy who has one, the guy with the one puzzle piece, he has that puzzle piece taken away from him, and it gets given to the one who has the 10. These are all similar parables and stories that are telling us this principle of being a disciple, that there's a responsibility that rests on us. And of course, the responsibility rests on Yah to be our teacher, which is exactly what Yeshua quoted, which is exactly what Yeshua came to do, which is exactly what Isaiah said. We will be taught by our God. Now, here's another. This is Luke chapter 14. I want you to pay real close attention to this, because this is going to get into sort of the order of things, if you would. This is Luke chapter 14 and verse 25. And listen to what it says. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters and his own life too, he is unable to be my disciple. Now, hold on a second. And I know I'm being a little facetious here, maybe even a little sarcastic here. Forgive me if this comes across the wrong way. But could you imagine those first couple of sentences being at an altar call? That those are the things that you get told to come on up? That's not what we're told. We're told God's going to give you, God's going to bless you, he's going to forgive you, he's going to wash you, he's going to make everything good, life's going to be good, he's going to heal you, he's going to do all these things. Here's the master talking. And he says, if you want to be my disciple, and he gives this standard. And listen, that's a tough standard. And of course, he doesn't mean you actually got to go hate these people. He's saying your love for Yah must supersede all of these other relationships. Your love for Yah has to supersede those things if you want to truly be his disciple. Remember, this is not about being a convert. This is not about joining up a church or an organization or anything else. This is about learning. This is about understanding who he is. So this is the master's words. These can't be changed. And unfortunately, these are words we don't really hear taught. We don't really hear put out there as part of the message, and yet these are the words of the master. This is right from his mouth telling us this is the standard. If you're supposed to go out to the world and make disciples, here's the standard of what a disciple is supposed to be. That Yah is supposed to be paramount in all things, even above those closest relationships that you have. And sometimes, and I'm sure we all have had this experience, those relationships sometimes go south because you are making Yah first in all things. But it doesn't stop there. Verse 27 says, And whoever does not bear his stake, and we just went over this last week's message. If you haven't checked it out, it's called Follow Me from this last weekend. Check it out. Where it talks about bearing the stake or bearing the cross. What it's actually saying is picking up the tent, the whole warp and woof thing. You guys can check that out. It's on YouTube. It's on the LMC app from last week's message. So information we kind of went over already. So whoever does not bear his stake or pick up his tent and come after me. So I guess we could say, and come after me certainly qualifies, I think would qualify as that statement of, well, you got to believe first. I mean, you got to really have at least an understanding, a desire that who he is, that God is there, that he loves you. That's got to be the initial thing that draws you, that Father's voice draws you. All right, so granted, that's there. That's part of the whole thing. But look at what it says, must come after me. One more time. Whoever does not bear his stake and come after me, his tent, is unable to be my taught one. And now he gives us a little bit of an example of what this actually means. What does it actually mean, to make him priority? What does it actually mean to pick up your tent? Listen. This is so important. Listen to these are Yeshua's instructions. For who of you wishing to build a tower? So in the analogy, what is the tower? It's our walk with him. It's following him, right? So if you're going to go build something, the idea is that, today in modern vernacular, you get a blueprint together, you have it all drawn up by an architect, you get all the materials, you get the pricing, you get everything all done. You don't just go out and you build a skyscraper. There's a process to doing it. So what he's telling us is that this process of discipleship, there's things we just have not been told before that are not part of the modern religious introduction that need to be, because they are, without these things, we won't become disciples. For who of you wishing to build a tower does not sit down first and count the cost? So guys, if we're using sort of the modern religious vernacular that, you answered an altar call and you said the prayer, this is telling us if you want to be a disciple, you need to consider what that actually means. Count the cost. Somebody needs to share with you, whoever it is that was ministering to you, that was sharing with you, that's what we're doing right now, needs to tell you what's really at stake here. What's the real issue? It's not about what he's going to do for you. It's not about all the blessings. It's not about health, wealth, prosperity, and all the rest of that, even though that's what we will hear again and again and again and again. Somebody's got to tell you the truth. And the truth is, as the master is telling us here, you must first count the cost. Now, I'll admit there's time in between, first beginning to understand, and then if you don't have a teacher that can shorten the time frame, for many of us it has taken us years and years and years and years, and despite all the stuff that's gone on around us, we were tenacious enough to continue pursuing. And Yah did teach us and he did lead us, and now we're understanding. But for some of us, it has taken many, many years to get where we are. My idea, my concept, as I read this, I think what Yeshua is saying is it was the disciples, it was the apostles' job, it was the shepherd's job to cut that time down. That it wasn't supposed to be that we go through all of this stuff, but that there were supposed to be teachers who would share the entirety of the story and tell us what this thing is really about, not just a puzzle piece to join up, but to tell us what the story truly is. So he tells us the first thing you have to do, the first thing, this is primary, is sit down and count the cost. Whether he has enough to complete it. So something is there's another analogy that is giving us with this counting of the cost, that when you sit down and you think about, well, this is what he's speaking about. This is what the story is. This is what the context truly is. You have to decide, and we've all kind of gone this route. At some point, we all made that decision that whatever it is, whatever the cost, I'm going to do it. Whatever the hardship, whatever the trial, whatever the hurt, whatever the loss, whatever it is, I'm not going to stop. I'm going to continue to pursue. We all have to make that decision. But somebody's got to tell us. There's supposed to be a teacher, a preacher, a shepherd that's supposed to tell us this. We got the books in our hands, so we can actually read it for ourselves now. We can listen to the Master's words. And these are words that when we are making disciples and becoming disciples, that we need to be very, very aware of. To sit down first and realize, what is this all really about? Because I don't want to start this. Again, think back to the whole 80-20 thing. Think back to how many people started this, or at least, started whatever the religious process is that we now have today. And how many people did not finish, have fallen away, have just gone by the wayside, or as I said, or just, going from place to place to place to place, each time looking for some sort of a spiritual high or, some sort of an excitement, and they get tired of that and then they go somewhere else. Well, this is what he's saying. As a matter of fact, listen to the next verse, verse 29. Otherwise, when he has laid the foundation, that is, he started. They understand. They truly do. They said that prayer. They meant it when they said it. They wanted to join whatever the organization is, whatever the name is. But otherwise, when he has laid the foundation or started and is unable to finish it, that is to understand the story and become a disciple, to count the cost and follow him no matter what. It says, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was unable to finish it. And that verse, that verse right there, outlines a lot of what we call religion today. It is a tremendous. Think about how many of our children, and I've seen this. These are just statistics. You guys can look this up. It's in the Barna studies and other statistical analysis of Christian or church life. Young people are dying on the vine here. There's not young people coming in. Why? Because they're looking at their parents who started and didn't finish. And if they didn't finish, then why would this be important to me? And they look at that and they say, this man began to build and was unable to finish, so why should I then begin to build? And it goes, obviously much, much deeper than that. This has to do with, who they are, the world around us, all the things that are pulling us in all sorts of different directions. But how many people use the excuse, well, I saw what this preacher did, and all preachers are like this, and this is how Christians are, and they're nasty, and some of the worst people I've met are Christians, and they could backbite and hurt you, and all of these things that they look at and say, this is what it means to be a man of God. This is what it means to be a woman of God. You see the guys with the planes and the money and all the craziness on television and evangelists and all the rest of that. And you look at that, and many look at that and say, that's it. That's what this is what I'm joining up for. And this is what the Master, I believe, is speaking about here. that we need to really think about what the cost is, so that, and here's the one thing that I can say, because there's the many who I've seen fall away over the years, but then there are the few that I have seen be consistent, that you can you see them today and come back in 5 years and they will still be that person. In fact, they'll have advanced even from there. We did a lot of ministry with young people over the years, had many children that we ministered to, even took into our own home. Some up, left, and did their own thing. Others pursued. Some left and did their own thing for a season and came back. But the one thing that they could see from Sister Karen and I, if they came back 5 years later, we were the same people. In fact, we were even more so the people than we were 5 years ago. We counted the cost. We did not give up. And that, when people see that, when they see that in you, and especially when young people see that in you, that makes a big difference. So I'm just, sort of throwing this out here as some examples of what it means to be a disciple. And again, there's more examples. Yeshua says salt, if it loses its saltiness, is good for what? For nothing. It gets thrown into the dunghill. He's talking about being a disciple. If you stop, if you don't count the cost, if you don't pursue on, well, then you become tasteless. And there's so many other teachings and parabolic phrases that the Master uses to teach us about being a disciple. Okay, so square peg in a round hole. Without the context, without finding out how does the story of the cross, how does the story of the crucifixion, death, and resurrection fit? If I'm going to be a disciple, I need to understand how it fits in everything else. I need to have an accurate context. Well, what has happened is, if we don't have the biblical context, and I'll explain what the biblical context is in a second, but if we don't have a biblical context, the probability of not completing is very, very high. Obviously we can meander through time and Yah will get that 20%. Hopefully that will, open up their eyes and really, really start to walk. But without the proper context, without understanding how that story fits in everything else that came, if we don't do that, if we don't know what came before and how it fits, what we have, or what we normally do, or what we have done over time, is we tend to make up context. We tend to take that one piece of the puzzle and stick it in as a square peg, stick it into a round hole, and we force it to fit. We make it fit. It doesn't fit. But again, get a bigger hammer. We hammer it in and we force a context to it. But the context that we know, that we have put on that story of the cross, of Golgotha, of Calvary, that story has that the context that we've created has done so much damage because it's not the true context. And without the true context, how can you then measure the cost? How can then you then decide? How can you learn? How can you be a disciple? That's why people are becoming converts and not disciples. So here's a couple of things. Without a proper biblical context, here are at least three. There's probably even more than that, but just for time's sake today, what we wind up doing is, and it's not just us, it's what the Pharisees did, it's what religion has done throughout all of the ages. We create a social context. Rather than a biblical context, we create a social context. Here is Luke chapter 5 and verse 30, and it says, "And the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled against Yeshua's taught ones, the disciples, saying, 'Why do you eat and drink with tax collectors and sinners?'" And there's another verse just like it. This is Luke chapter 15 and verse 1. Same concept, same idea. "Now all the tax collectors and the sinners were coming to him to hear him. And the Pharisees and the scribes grumbled, saying, 'This one receives sinners and eats with them.'" They created a different social order. They created a social gospel. those people who are the sinners, well, they're over there. They're sinners. They're not like us, and we don't want them here. And how could your disciples even be with those people? You're supposed to be with us, the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the people who are rich, and the people who are blessed, the people who are prospered. And this created a social, quote unquote, a social gospel, whereby you're joining up of this thing. You joined our group, but you didn't join their group. You stayed away from their group. They weren't allowed in the temple. And later on, when we'll deal with this on a weekend message, but when Yeshua begins to really beat up the Pharisees about the whole Abraham's bosom thing, you see, he takes this concept, because they all thought they're the ones that are going to see resurrection. They're the ones that are going to see paradise. But all the sinners, all the people who are sick, all the people, that the tax collectors, et cetera, they're going to wind up going into lake of fire. They're going to be the ones that are going to suffer and burn. But we are going to be the ones that are going to be at the wedding feast. We're going to be at Abraham's table, Abraham's bosom, as the way they called it. We'll talk more about Abraham's bosom, where that comes from, and all the rest of that on a weekend message. But Yeshua flips it on them, and he tells them, no, it's the rich man who winds up there, and the poor guy who you guys hate because it's a social gospel, he winds up at the wedding feast of the Lamb. So he flips it on them. But I want you to see there was this social order of this concept, this idea that if you are part of our social group, our name, our fellowship, our denomination, then you are in the right spot. But if you're like so-and-so and you don't have that, or you're here or you're there, that's a different story. And we do this today. It was done in the days of the Pharisees, and it's been done throughout history because we lost the context. The Pharisees didn't get who Yeshua was. They didn't understand the context themselves. And Yeshua told them, you don't know Moses. You don't understand the context. Well, when we don't understand the context, one of the things we wind up doing is creating a social context. Today, we would call it, in our modern religion, denominations, sects, groups, names, from Catholic to Protestant to evangelical. And the idea is that when you come, you're actually joining us. You're joining our group. And you guys have all heard this. We've all heard this before. Not that group. We do things differently than that group. They do that, or they sing this way, or they speak that way, or they got gifts and they don't have gifts, and they've got statues and they don't have and we're the real church and they're not the real church, and it becomes it's a social structure that they've taken the picture, the puzzle piece of the cross, and they've hammered the heck out of it to fit the social structure. And we do it today. We see it all over the place. That is joining up. That is being one to something. If you can be one to something, as soon as you get offended and hurt, you're going to be lost to that thing. We need to be disciples. We need to learn. It's not about denomination. And again, this is why there's some 40,000 some odd denominations. They become a social group. You join up a church, a congregation, and you get whatever benefits come with it, and you get voting rights, or if it's a big congregation, you get access to the local gym, or whatever it is, whatever the things are. You can be in ministry or this or that and the other thing. And it becomes a social construct. And there is definitely a social element to what we do. We are social people. We are supposed to be a community, but not like this. Not like this, where it's us versus them. And there's 40,000 different us's and thems. The scripture tells us there's one faith, one Lord, one Yah, one baptism, just one. Well, how can there be one when we've got 40,000 different ones, and probably even more than that? Why? Because we've taken a square peg, a square red peg. That is that puzzle piece of the story of the Son of God dying and resurrecting, and we've made it fit into our hole, into our circular hole. We put that square peg in and we hammered the heck out of it to make it fit. And it doesn't work. It doesn't work. And what we wind up doing, or what we have done, is most will fall away or never really become a disciple, never really understand, never really count the cost. And like as Yeshua said, they become twice as much the son of the grave than they were before. So there's the social context that we put on our culture. Here is the second one, an ethnic context. So you got your social, us, them. Then there's the ethnic part. Again, if you don't know what the whole story is about, then we come up with these things. Here's Acts chapter 10. So again, this isn't just us. This is stuff we see in the gospel story. Here's Acts chapter 10 and verse 28. And this is Peter with the sheet that comes down. And the issue is the us and them, ethnicity. We don't like Gentiles. Gentiles don't like us. They're dogs. We're Jews. There's this animosity. And he said to them, you know that a Jewish man is not allowed to associate with or to go to the house, to one of another race, to go into the house of one of another race. But Elohim has shown that I should not call any man common or unclean. So I show you this verse. We talked about this before. We were in the book of Romans, but I show you this verse to show you that even in that day, there was also this ethnic context that it depended upon what race you belong to, what group you belong to. And you treated people from another group, another race, differently. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 14, again, another familiar verse should be to all of us. Here is Saul talking about this issue of division, of ethnic division, not just social division within one ethnic group. Now we're talking about an ethnic division between groups. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 14, for he, meaning Messiah, is our peace, who has made both, two different ethnic groups. And having broken down the partition of the barrier, the balustrade, the wall in the temple, having abolished it in his flesh, the enmity, and I put it in red, but I want to explain it, the Torah of the commands in dogma. That does not mean that Messiah on the cross got rid of the Torah. It means what he got rid of is the dogma, the religious rules, the things that separated ethnic groups that were man-made from Torah. They took Torah and they twisted it and they added to it and they justified their own prejudices with it because they didn't understand the context. They didn't understand what the story was about. They didn't understand the full breadth and width and height and length of what this story was. So the baseness of men had them separating and hating one another. So it's not the Torah that the cross, that's not the enmity. The enmity is not the Torah. The enmity are the dogmas, the doctrines, the teachings that they use the Torah to make them, but that's the man-made ethnic religion is what's being spoken about here. So as to create in himself one renewed man from the two, thus making peace. So here it is, just two other parts. We can see that this whole ethnic context was there in the first century. It was there before the first century. It's there after the first century. It is absolutely here today. And just look at history, the way history has unfolded religiously. And you can look at really any religion for this, but we're dealing with Christianity. We're dealing with even Islam and things like that. But how many times, especially here in American history and Western history, has religion been propped up by race, called white religion, or black religion, or Asian religion, white churches, black churches, Asian churches, and the list goes on and on and on and on and on. Settlers came into the States, and of course the Native Americans that were here, the religion that the white man brought was the white man's religion. And we wound up doing exactly what Ephesians 2 said Yeshua died for us not to do. We divided ourselves up again ethnically. And again, just look at the history of America, the history of our past, which is kind of relevant, especially to all the stuff we hear about today, because it's still out there. It's still there. And listen, I get it. Sometimes you live in a community and the community that you're living in may just be there's places in Queens here, in the city here that are ethnically one particular group of people. You go to certain areas in Queens and it's Korean. I would expect there to be a Korean church, but is it supposed to just be a Korean church or a white group or a black group or a Spanish group? The idea was that we get past those things. We go beyond those things. And that only happens when you understand the context, when you begin to realize those things, the color of our skin, the differences between us is actually what makes us wonderful. Yeah, I do love our congregation because we are a tapestry of every color and every ethnic background. And the fantastic thing is when we get together and we eat food, we get food from just about everywhere in the world. And we got some great cooks in our congregation. To me, the colors, all the different, that ethnic gospel is dangerous. It divides people. It has in the past, and it still does today. But why do we do that? Because we don't understand the context. We don't understand what the bigger picture is. And so we go back to our base instincts, which is, nation against nation, ethnicity against ethnicity. That's the way it was then. That is the way it is today. One more, national context. So you've got a social context, us and them, within an ethnic group. Then you have ethnic context, us and them, between racial differences. And then you have national context. And this is Acts chapter 10. Now, this is Peter speaking really against the idea, or showing how it's not about national context. But here it is, Acts chapter 10. It says, in opening his mouth, verse 34, Peter said, truly I see that Elohim shows no partiality, no differences, but in every nation, he who fears him and works righteousness is accepted by him. So what winds up happening historically in the story of the gospel? All right, the disciples are sent out. They're told Judea, Samaria, uttermost parts of the world, Jerusalem to the uttermost parts of the world. They are supposed to be making disciples. Very, very quickly, they have the issue of ethnic context that they got to deal with. They got to deal with social context. And very, very soon, by the end of the first century, getting into the second century, national context became. National context came in and replaced the message. It replaced the true biblical context of what this story was really about. They kept the one puzzle piece. They kept the red square piece, but they began hammering that story into a different context, into a national context. And you can see I got two pictures up there. Hopefully everybody can see them. One, and these are two very, very famous, very, very old murals, paintings. These are supposed to be the Christ. One is the Greek version. And this happened really by the end of the first century, getting into the second century. Nationalistic ideas. There was a disdain from one national group to another, and the Greeks began to create a concept of the cross, of the one who died and rose again, but they took it out of its biblical context and they made it national. They made it Greek, and you can see there in the picture. You've got the picture of that individual, obviously dressed up in some sort of Greek clothing, a toga. And he's got the sun disk behind him, so it's an association with the sun god, which is totally out of its biblical context. But you got the picture of the sun disk behind it. He's making the Baphomet signals. Sometimes it's the fingers that are like this, and you got the ones like this. I know I joke around, say he's flashing gang signs, but these actually are very important. These are symbols that have to do with the sun god. They have to do with Lucifer. They have to do with the false light. And I don't know if you can see it. I don't know if you may be watching this on a big screen TV, hopefully. If you look real close, you can just go online and maybe download this picture. If you look real close, the book that he's holding are not the Hebrew scriptures. They are the Greek scriptures. And this, you may say, oh, well, they were Greeks. And so they took who he was out of the context of what the rest of the book is about, and they put him in a nationalistic context, also an alternative religious context, but that's another story for another day. But here, a nationalistic context. Now, the picture that's right next to it, now this is about 300 years later, Rome, with almost 300 years later, Rome also does the same thing. So first you've got the Greeks that are doing it, then it becomes the Romans that do it, and they do the same thing. They take the one who they heard of, the piece they got, the piece of the puzzle, or the red square peg that they got, and they hammered it into their nationalistic concepts and ideas. And again, if you look at the picture, that's supposed to be a picture of the risen Christ, and you can see also he's got the sun disk behind his head. This is Apollo now. By the time this comes around, the other Greek gods and all the rest of it, they have kind of gone by the wayside. But the Romans, the world is still worshiping a sun god, Apollo primarily. And so that's Apollo, the disk behind him. And don't forget, this is supposed to be the risen Messiah. It's supposed to be a painting of the risen Messiah. And look how he's dressed. Unlike what we saw on the first picture, the Greek clothing, now he's wearing not just Roman clothing. This isn't just Roman clothing that's being worn here. This is what a general, a military officer, a high-ranking military officer, the guy who would be in charge of the military. That's what a Roman general would wear. So we've got now the one who supposedly died and rose again with an alternative religious backing, the mixing of things. Again, if you know the scripture, we're not supposed to do that, but another story, another day. And now they're taking them and they're hammering it into a circular hole. They're hammering this square peg into us and trying to make it fit, and depicting him. And of course, he has the sign of the cross. He's holding on to that behind him, under his feet. I think he's stepping on a serpent and also on a lion. And if you could get in really, 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 really close, if you like on the Greek one, it's on one part of the book it's Greek, on the other part it's English. But if you look at the Roman one, it's Latin. And so now they've changed the context, the historical, the biblical context, and they've beat it into a nationalistic context. And from all of this, look at what we get. And here's just a short list right under here. We go from Greek Orthodox to Roman Catholicism to Russian Orthodox to Armenian Christian to Western Europe Protestant to today American evangelicals. And we, again, you think about just American evangelicals today, and that's synonymous with apple pie and Americana and being conservative, and it's got a political attachment to it. It has a nationalistic. We may not think of it that way, but it's a nationalistic. God's for us. God's for our nation. Well, I don't know. Let me just save that for another day. But we assume, because we are who we are, that we are these American believers, well, he must be for us. Just like the Greek Orthodox did, the Romans, the Armenians, and the list goes on and on and on and on and on and on and on. And I'm probably forgetting a half a dozen others that are nationalistic identities that have taken the context, the true context, removed it, and taken that square peg and nailed it into a circular hole. This is what men do. This is what religion has done. Why? Because we were not told the story, or they didn't want to hear the story. They removed the story and they made up their own context. All right, a lot more to say on that, but I'm kind of running out of time. Here is John chapter 4 and verse 22. Now, I want to say this. Let me go back here just for a second, because what I'm about to share with you, I think we've all had this experience at some point. If not, I'm sure that you'll get it. We've all had an experience when we first started to really understand what this thing was about. Now, what I'm about to say to the 80%, if you would, this sounds off the wall. This to hear this as it would have sounded to Roman Catholicism, to Greek Orthodox, to Armenian, etc., 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 etc. This sounds weird. This sounds no. This cannot be. This is not. This cannot be the context. But I'm going to share with you what the true overarching context is of the Bible, and we need to know this. This is something I could only wish now was told to me, 30 some odd years ago. I'm grateful that I understand it now, but I all the time we could have saved. But here we are now. We've all heard things like this before. So I'm going to give you what the true context is here. I don't want you to misunderstand it. So it's not going to just be me kind of quoting or me saying it. I'm going to let Yeshua tell us what the actual context is, that we must understand the crucifixion, the death, the resurrection, and the ascension, that puzzle piece, that red square peg, and make it fit into a square hole so it fits correctly. It fits accurately. It helps us understand the story. It helps us to become disciples. It helps us to put the beginning, the middle, and the ending together and understand it in its proper context. But again, this is offensive to many people. I know you've all gone through this, and you'll see exactly what I'm saying, what I'm talking about in just a second. So here's the next tile. This is John chapter 4 and verse 22. These are the words of Yeshua. Please listen carefully. He's talking to the woman at the well, right? To a Samaritan, a Gentile. He tells her, you Gentiles, the nations, you worship what you do not know. We, and by we, he means Jews. Now, we're saying Jews because Judah is the only lost sheep of the house of Israel that's there at that time, and all of the tribes were there within Judah, but it was the southern kingdom, or what was left of the southern kingdom by the time Yeshua comes. So when he says Jews, he means the lost sheep of the house of Israel, the only tribe that's left, the multiple tribes that are left, but the only house that is left. So, yeah, there's the northern house, there's the southern house, but in the context of what he's saying, he means the house of Israel. When he says Jews, he means the whole thing. They are just the group that's there. They are the one of the two houses that is left, at least up to this point. And then after the resurrection, 70 years later, we know, or 40 years later, we know what happens. So we, Jews, or the lost sheep of the house of Israel, we worship what we know. And here it is, because deliverance, and again, that's sort of the scriptures version. If you read another version, it says, because salvation is of the Jews. Let that sink in a second. Let that sink in, because we read this and we read this and we read this and we read this and we read this for years and years and years and years, and people are still reading it today and are not listening to what the master is saying. He's giving us the proper context for everything. This whole thing is based not on, and let me make a distinction here. He is not saying salvation is of Judaism, because the master rails on the Pharisees and the scribes and their religion that makes Yah's word powerless or void. It's not about Judaism, but salvation, the understanding, the context for everything is from the Jews. And if you remove that, if you make it a social context, if you make it an ethnic context, if you make it a a national context, and you take that peg out of this Jewish, this house of Israel, this 12 tribes, this children of Jacob context, you wind up taking that peg and you're going to put it in a different hole. And it's not going to work, and it's not going to be the same story, and you're not going to be able to count the cost, and you're going to fail, and salt is going to lose its saltiness. That's how important this is. Now I get it. This was offensive to the Greeks. This was offensive to the Romans. It was offensive to the Gentiles. It was offensive throughout all the religious history, and it's still offensive today. How many of you have had the experience from friends, neighbors, family, that they saw that, you're growing in your faith, you're learning, you're studying, you want to share some stuff with them. And how many of us have heard these words? What, are you Jewish? Right? We've all heard it. It's been said to all of us. Are you Jewish? And normally our response is, no, I'm not. I'm not practicing. What we say is, I'm not practicing Judaism. I'm actually doing what Messiah said to do. I'm actually understanding what this is really about. But you see that the concept of most around us, when they begin to see, even in our experience, in our practicing, they begin to see this faith in its proper context, it's offensive. It's offensive. Well, that's legalism. We've all heard that before too. That's legalism. You're doing Jewish stuff. That's the stuff Messiah came to get rid of. What? That is the context of everything. It is the context. Again, let me say this again, because I don't want anybody to misunderstand. I am not telling you that Judaism gives salvation or salvation is of Judaism, but salvation comes through the Jewish people, i.e. the house of Israel, i.e. the 12 tribes, i.e. the children of Jacob, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That is where salvation comes from. And if we don't get that, if we don't understand that, if we don't go back and look at things in that context, we're not going to get it. And we're not going to be disciples. We may want to join a group, but we're not going to be disciples. So again, house of Israel, northern house, Israel, southern house, Judah. But the house of Israel, the northern house, has already been scattered, and the only ones left are Judah, and that already has multiple tribes inside of it. But they're called Judah. They're called Jews. That's just the way it is. We got to wrap our minds around that. Here's John chapter 1 and verse 12. Very familiar verse, but now understand it in the context, the whole biblical context. Salvation is of the Jews, to the Jew first, and then also to the Gentile. It says he came to his own. Well, I know if you read that sort of today in a modern context, people are saying, well, he came to humanity. Well, yes, he did. There's no doubt he came to humanity. But he didn't go to Rome. I'm sorry, Yeshua did not go to Rome. Yeshua did not go to the Greeks. Yeshua did not go to the Armenians. Yeshua did not go to the Russian Orthodox. He didn't go to any of those groups. He was none of those things. What he did, though, is he came to his own. Who? The lost sheep of the house of Israel. Judah, the Jews of their day. And the Jews, the leaders, his own people, did not receive him. But as many Jews, because this is the story of the first century of the year ministry of Yeshua, this isn't about what happens, 300 years later. This is about what happens then. But as many Jews as received him, to them he gave the authority to become the children of Elohim, to those believing in his name. Now, yes, can you take this and sort of extrapolate it out to who we are? I think that's fine. I think, yes, he came to his own. He came to humanity. Humanity rejects him. And all of us that do receive him, to us, he gives the ability to be the sons of God. But the proper context of this is he's talking about Judah. He's talking about the Jews. He came to the Jews. Many rejected him. Others that didn't, to them, he made them disciples. He made them apostles. He made them go out as evangelists and make disciples of the nations. That's what this is telling us. And it's throughout the book, even though I listen, this is offensive to people. They hear this because I know this may sound crazy, but I remember one day, I forgot who it was or what the context was. We were looking at a picture of the Last Supper, I think by Michelangelo, if I'm getting the right medieval artist right. The whole Michelangelo thing, and you could see it's the whole picture there, and they're eating semolina bread, and and it's supposed to be the Passover, and they've got like Italian bread on the table and pasta and everything else that's up there for Passover. And I had said something that to the effect that they didn't eat semolina bread. They didn't eat this stuff. It would have been unleavened bread. This is not the way the Passover would have been done, because that's not the way the Jews do it. And I remember somebody saying, literally, in all sincerity, asking me, "You mean Jesus was an Italian?" And they meant it. I mean, they literally meant it. I know it sounds a little bit funny now, but that was the context. We've taken him out of the true biblical context, and we've tried to fit him nationally or ethnically or socially into a different context that is just not him, and it destroys the story, it destroys the picture, and you cannot become a disciple off of that. John chapter 1, here's 2 Samuel, just a couple of verses. Guys, I could probably throw out 50, 100 more verses, similar to this, but here's just a couple. The title of our Elohim, our God, who is Yeshua in the flesh. Here's his title. He is the God of Israel. 2 Samuel chapter 23 and verse 2. It says, the Spirit of Yehovah, of the Spirit of Yah, let me just get to the right thing here. The Spirit of Yah has spoken through me, and his word is on my tongue. The Elohim, the God of Israel. Who is he? He tells us what his name and title is. He is the God of Israel. He's not the God of Rome. He's not the God of Greece. He's not the God of Armenia. He's not the God of the Russian Orthodox. He is the God of Israel. And the Rock of Israel spoke to me, one who rules over man righteously. Here is Isaiah chapter 37 and verse 16. It says, O Yah of hosts, and here it is again. What's he called? Elohim, God of Israel. Not all of these other things, all the way up to where we say it today, bringing it all the way to where we are today. He is still and always will be the God of Israel. The one who dwells between the cherub. You are Elohim, you alone. We say that every week. You are Elohim, and there is no other like you. What Elohim? The Elohim of Israel. Yah inhabits the praises of his people, Israel. Who reigns on the earth. You have made the heavens and the earth. Here's Jeremiah 31:31. We're going to look at this again in a second. But here it is. See, the days are coming, declares Yah, when I shall make a covenant, a renewed covenant with who? Who is the new covenant made with? The house of Israel and the house of Judah. Not with the Roman Catholic Church, not with the Episcopalian Church, not with the Armenian Church, and the list goes on and on and on and on and on. It is made with the house of Israel. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 12. At that time, so some would say, well, yeah, but aren't all those groups kind of in it? Yeah, if they understand the context, and we are being disciples and we're walking after him and we are counting the cost, as Yeshua said, then like Peter said, God is a respecter of no people. He'll bring them all in. But how is he bringing us in? Because this is the context again. It is salvation is of the Jews. Ephesians 2 and verse 12. We've done this a couple of times, so this should be, sort of familiar to everybody. Excuse me. And at that time, you Gentiles were without Messiah, excluded from the citizenship of Israel, and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no expectation and without Elohim in the world. That was the Gentiles. But who was he, or what did we not have? We did not have citizenship in the house of Israel. Verse 19 then goes on to say, so now in Messiah, so the context of who he truly is as the one who came to Judah, who came to the Jew, who came to the lost sheep of the house of Israel first, now because of our faith in him, so then you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens. Citizens of what? The house of Israel. Of the set apart ones, the Jews, Judah, lost sheep of the house of Israel, and members of the household of Elohim. So the context, the true context, and again, this was offensive right from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century, all the way through the medieval ages, all the way up to modern age. Wait, you're telling us we're supposed to be part of the house of Israel? Yes, 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 and yes. That's the biblical context. That's the correct national context. That's the correct social context. That's the correct ethnic context, which isn't even an ethnicity because it's made of strangers, native born and foreign born, all together becoming one new man. Now, I know somebody would say, well, yeah, but doesn't Galatians say that there's no more Jew, there's no more Greek, there's no more male, there's no more female. We are all one in Messiah. So aren't those things done away with? Guys, there's still male. There's still females. There's still Jew. There's still Gentile. What he's saying is those divisions are gone. Those things that separate us are gone. Those ethnic clashes are supposed to be gone. We are supposed to be one, but we are one in the house of Israel. We are part of the children of Abraham. So again, in its proper context, which has to be the biblical context from the beginning of Genesis all the way to Revelation, it is about the story. It ultimately is about the story. It is a Jewish story is really what it comes down to. And I think that's what the next thing says. Yeah. This is the correct context for everything that we do. It is a Jewish story. And it's a Jewish story by design. And unless we get that, again, when we say Jewish, I don't separate that from the lost sheep of the house of Israel, from the whole house of Israel, both tribes, or all 12 tribes, or both houses, because that's who we mean. That's who I'm referring to when I say Jews, the whole house of Israel. Here's just a statement. Elohim did not call an already established people called the Jews or called the house of Israel. He did not call an already established culture called Jewish culture or the house of Israel culture. Elohim actually made the culture of the house of Israel. And that's the key point. He made it. He designed it. He gave the culture. He gave the language. He gave the whole, everything ethnic about it, everything religious about it, everything about it. He did, because it was to portray the salvation that would be given to the entire world. Here's Deuteronomy chapter 7 and verses 6 and 8. It says, for you, Israel, Judah, the whole house of Israel, are set apart people to Yah, your Elohim. Yah, your Elohim, has chosen you to be a people for himself, a treasured possession above all peoples on the face of the earth. Now, I'm not just telling you this is just for just anybody who is Jewish, because we find out by the time Messiah comes, the true Israel of God is a combination of native-born and sojourners and foreigners who are sojourners and foreigners no more, but they're still called the true house of Israel. This is why Paul later on tells us not everything that is Israel or everything that is Jewish is actually Jewish. Here is a true Jew, I think Romans 2:28, I think. A Jew is not one who is one outwardly, but a Jew is one who is one inwardly. He has chosen you to be a people for himself, a treasured possession above all the peoples of the face of the earth. Yah did not set his love on you, nor choose you, because you were more numerous than the other peoples, for you were the least of all peoples. But because of Yah's loving you and because of him guarding the oath which he swore to our fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. We're going to talk about that this upcoming weekend. Yah has brought you out with a strong hand and ransomed you from the house of bondage, from the hand of Pharaoh, sovereign of Mitzrayim. And he's just setting them up here saying, listen, I loved you. I chose you. This is the group of people that Yah is going to make the example and show salvation to the world through this people. If we try to understand salvation outside of this, then we are putting it in its improper context. And lots and lots of major issues have come because we've done that over the ages. Elohim formed them. He actually formed them. The native born and the grafted in strangers. Right from the beginning, it's always been native born and grafted in strangers. It's always been that mixture of people. Here's Exodus 12:49. And when a stranger sojourns with you, you shall perform the Passover. All of us are supposed to do the Passover. Let all his males be circumcised, and then let them come near and perform it, and he shall be as the native of the land. But let no uncircumcised eat of it. There is one Torah for the native born, for the stranger who sojourns among you. Same law, same instruction for everybody. That's got to be the context from the beginning all the way to the end. This is a Jewish story. This is a house of Israel story. So here's the big context. I want to sort of wrap this up. If this is a Jewish story and Yah made the culture, Yah put the practices in, Yah gave the language, all of that stuff, right? If he designed this culture to show salvation to the world, I get why Satan doesn't want us to have anything to do with the culture. He wants us to throw it away because without it, there's no context. There's no context and there's no way to truly become a disciple because you're going to wind up, sticking that square peg in a round hole. We're going to talk about over the weekend the covenant of death. Well, I'll share a little tile of that in just a second. But there's a couple of different covenants. But all of this is in the context of Jewish life, of Israeli life, of the house of Israel life, including the wedding covenant. So I'm just using this as an example to show you that we need to understand this in its proper context if we're going to understand it at all, if we are truly going to be disciples. So a Jewish wedding, and I'm not going to get it. I'm just doing a cursory thing here. There's a lot more detail. You guys can look this up, or maybe we'll do another study another day. But a Jewish wedding has some parts to it, even today, amongst those who have nothing to do with Messiah, but the culture is still there. But certainly in Yeshua's day and before, the way a wedding was done is there was a father and a son, and a father normally picked the bride for his son. So there's a father and there's a son. The father picks a bride for the son. There is two witnesses are picked, one to work with the bride, one to work with the groom. Today, and I don't know how far back this tradition goes, but today those two witnesses or those two assistants, consider them wedding planners, if you would. The two wedding planners, their names are Elijah and Moses. That's what they're called today. And they serve that role of instruction. Remember, Yeshua talks about John the Baptist as the Elijah, that the friend of the bridegroom. That's the Elijah. That's what he's talking about. You won't understand those words if you don't have the Jewish story, if you don't have the story of Israel to understand it. So there's these two witnesses, and something called a ketubah gets made, a contract, a rules book, or a book of instruction that tells the bride how she is supposed to act, what her responsibilities are, and also what the responsibilities of the future husband are supposed to be. And through a big ceremony, normally with food and wine, this contract is signed by the both of them. It is signed and they are then engaged. They are then betrothed, but they don't actually stay together at that point. The son then goes away to the father's home, his business, and either builds an extension on the house or builds his business. And when the father decides the son has done everything he can now go back and get his bride, he sends the son back for the bride, who was supposed to read the ketubah and learn to be a good wife of the house of Israel, to do that for a husband, which she should do, while the husband is doing what he should do for his bride. And at some point, he will come back in a great celebration and take his bride with him. This is a Jewish story. This is a Jewish wedding. This is a house of Israel wedding. This is a 12 tribes wedding. Here's John chapter 14. You guys should be familiar with this. If you understand this, that salvation is of the Jews, then this makes sense to you. John 14:2. In my Father's house are many staying places, and if it were not so, and if not, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you, just like the marriage ceremony. And if I go and prepare a place for you, I shall come again and receive you to myself, that where I am, you might be also. He's talking to his bride. The father has picked a bride. The son is there with the bride, giving them instruction. Ketubah, the two witnesses appear. When? At the transfiguration, you got Moses and Elijah, the two witnesses, the law and the prophets, right there. And the ketubah, the instruction that was given to the bride. All of this is a wonderful, wonderful Jewish story. Jeremiah 31:31. This betrothal took place a long time ago on Mount Sinai. It's also found in Hebrews 8. See, the days are coming, declares Yah, when I shall make a renewed covenant, again with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, but not like the covenant I made with their fathers in the day that I strengthened their hand to bring them out of the land of Mitzrayim. My covenant which they broke, though I was a betrothed husband to them. So this marriage ceremony went on a long time ago. And now Yeshua comes to renew the marriage covenant. The marriage covenant with his bride. Here is Matthew chapter 26 and verse 27. And taking the cup and giving thanks, because this is always done at a dinner with wine and giving thanks, he gave it to them, saying, drink all of it, all of you, for this is my blood of the renewed covenant, the new wedding. What kind of wedding? A Hebrew wedding, a Jewish wedding, a house of Israel wedding. A renewed covenant which is shed for many. For who? For native born and for strangers that are now going to be grafted in to make up the true house of Israel. But I say to you, I shall certainly not drink of this fruit of the vine from now on until the day when I drink it anew with you, when my Father sends me back, just like the wedding, in the reign of my Father at the wedding feast. The only way we understand these words and how they are applicable to us is to understand salvation is of the Jews. It's of Judah. It's of Israel. It's of the Hebrews. It's of the 12 tribes. That is the context. Remove that context and you got to twist all of this stuff and change all of this stuff and say, well, the Gentile church is the bride. Israel's not the bride anymore. And all of it, we're taking square pegs and we're nailing them into, just beating the tar out of them, trying to put them into circular holes. And it just does not work. And you cannot become a disciple doing that. You learn all sorts of crazy stuff. And thankfully, Yah is faithful to those who truly, truly do want to learn. So this story, the overarching story, because that's our first point. The overarching story is that this is a Jewish story. This is a story of the house of Israel and the house of Judah. That's the context for everything. We cannot remove that context. We must understand that context. If you remove that context, you change the whole picture. You remove that, you remove that idea, the whole picture gets changed. Whether or not we think we understand the final piece, because lots of people do, that outside of the rest of this story is just a final piece. And what we wind up doing is putting it in contexts that are incorrect. And all sorts of problems come out of that. We cannot fit a square peg into a round hole. but it fits perfectly where Yah designed for it to fit. So that's our study for you guys for tonight. I hope you guys enjoyed that. I got one more tile I want to show you. We're going to talk about the Abrahamic covenant. We're going to talk about really what Yeshua came to do, or at least one of the two aspects. One certainly is to renew the marriage covenant, but there's something else that's also going on. So I invite you to join us this weekend for our upcoming weekend message. It is entitled Covenant of Death. Covenant of Death is going to be a neat study. You guys are going to really, really enjoy that. So don't forget to be part of that on Sunday morning at 10:45. And I hope you guys enjoyed that. I know a little bit different study than we normally do, more topical, but still stuff. I want us to get the general idea. By the end of this, we'll have a good idea on how to minister to somebody. And you know what's going to happen? You're going to try to talk to some people about this, and they're not going to want to hear a word. They're not. We got to be careful. We can't milk people in. We can't offer them to be a convert and then hope to change them later. We either give them the truth or not. And the idea is to cut down that time of wandering amongst the waves and the winds and all sorts of doctrines and learn to become a disciple. We were told to go out and make disciples. So anyway, with that, guys, thank you so much for joining me tonight. Don't forget, if you haven't, and you're not, hopefully most of you guys are, but hit the subscribe button, hit the bell to be notified so that every time we go live, you guys will get the information. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with us. Don't forget to be part of Morning Manna tomorrow, bright and early. And then, of course, on Saturday on the Sabbath as we celebrate and we have our hidden manna. Guys, have a great, great rest of the week. And as always, shalom.